Understand how JavaScript run functions in order and how callbacks control the flow. So let's look at how JavaScript run functions in the order they are called. I'm going to be using about three different examples in this lesson. Number one is to show a manual sequence of how others can be called manually. Number two is to show an example of how functions can be called automatically. And finally, how we can use callbacks to solve the problems of functions invocation in our code. So let's move ahead and make the first example. So for the first example, I don't need much. So I just need two paragraph tag. One is going to just code the result of the calculation, and then the second one is going to be a p tag with an id of demo. Then let's move into the script tag and add the function. So the first function I want to make is to display some data, and I'm going to call the name my displayer. My displayer is going to take a parameter of sum, and then inside it I can use the get element by id of my p tag that I have, where I want the update to happen, and use inner.html to change its content, putting this as my the value of my parameter. Now that I have this function to display some data, you can see that nothing is showing yet on my screen. Then I can go ahead and make a function to calculate a sum. So function, then I can give it a name of my calculator, and it will take two parameters, number one and number two. And then inside it, I can sum this. Let sum equals to num1 plus num2. And then I can return the sum as the output for my code. Now that I have the function to calculate the sum, now I can call the calculator. And how do I call the calculator? Let me make a variable and assign the result of the calculator into it. My calculator, and pass in two variables, maybe 6 and 6, two data or parameters which are needed in order for it to work. Then I can call the displayer, which is my displayer, the first function that I have. So since the function, the value of my calculator, which happens to be my calculator function, is already storing the results, then I can use my displayer in order to show us the result, and you will see that the screen will change immediately I do that. And you can see that the output is 12. 6 plus 6 is equal to 12. Now, one thing about this function is that you can see that these functions are, being called one after the other, and you must call two separate functions before you finally get your answer. So the problem with this is that there are too many steps and it's not really flexible. Imagine if you have multiple functions, then it could give you a problem due to many multiple steps that needs to be called. So let's look at the second example. So in this second example, we are going to see how one function can call another function. So I'll wipe everything I have inside my script tag. I no longer need them. And then I can then just go ahead and look at the example that we need for this particular section. So let's go ahead and move into the script tag. So what I have inside my HTML section is okay. So let me just move into the script tag, and then we can start adding the functions that we need. Now this time as well, we're going to make function to display some data. And just like the first example, let's call it my displayer. To take sum as parameters, and then we can select the element where we want changes to happen, which is demo1, which is my p tag, and then use the inner HTML to modify its content once the real value is actually available. Now that I have this function, then I need to make another function, and this time It is also to calculate sum. Same example, but different method of how they work. Calculate a sum. So this also is going to be my calculator. To take two parameters, number one and number two. So then I can go ahead and then add this together. And then I have number one added to number two. But if you look at this place, you see that in the first example, we were returning sum before we now went down to call the function. But this time around, we are not returning sum. So we want to pass this function directly. What is this function? To call our sum function. So I will just pass it in like this. My displayer, I want it to give me the value of that function. So now that I have this, I can just come down here and call my calculator itself and pass in the variables, the parameter that it expected. And now you can see the result is 10. You can see now that here we have, what would I call this? Okay, so here we have fewer problem in the sense that one function can call the other. So instead of calling two functions here, we have just one function. So this is already calling this, and then we have just one. Only one function call is needed. But the problem with this method is that you lose control, and this calculator will always display. And you cannot use this my calculator for other purposes in your code. So let's say you have other use cases in your code, you cannot use this function as it is. So that's the problem with this method. Now let's look at the third method where we can use callback in order to solve all of these issues at once. So using a callback, we can call the calculator function with a callback, and then let the calculator function run the callback after the calculation is finished. So what do I mean by that? Look at this example. So here you can just call my calculator function with a callback, and then it will now run the callback after the calculation is finished. So let's go ahead and see how we can use callback in order to solve this problem. So we are still going to need my displayer function my displayer. So take a parameter of sum and then document.get element by id of sum. So we have my displayer function. Now function to calculate a sum. Function my calculator. Now this time around as well, we are not returning sum. Instead, we'll pass in my callback like this, my callback. But this time around, you can see this red squiggly line, my callback sum. You can see this is gray out because it's not declared anyway. And that is because I needed to add it to my parameters here. So I will pass in the callback function, the callback here, my callback. Now, once I pass it here, then I can usually use it in order to call the calculator function. And so the result will now display after the calculation is finished. So now that I'm calling the function like this, then I can just come down and then call my calculator. Then I'll pass in the parameters 7, 7. So this will both run, and after they are run, my displayer will now then display my results. And you should see on the screen, I should have 10, that evidently something is wrong somewhere. You can see it. My editor is already giving me pointer. So it's documents, not this wrong spelling. So now you should see changes now, 7 by 7, 14. So that means that this my callback function, it will run this function. So it will sum this together in the background, and once the result is available, then it will just pass it to this my displayer, which will then give us the output, as you can see right here on my screen. Now, if you look at what we have done with my callback function, you can see that functions can be passed like variable, just as the way we pass the callback function. Now, A JavaScript run functions in sequence, just as you saw in the first example. But sometimes we want more control. Instead of calling functions manually or encoding behavior, we can pass a function into another function, and that is called a callback. It gives us flexibility and control execution. Now you may want to ask, why don't we use example 2 all the time? Since example 2 also uses one function called, and it is better and more flexible than the first one. The first one. The problem is that it removes flexibility. So it's not as flexible as using a callback to solve this problem. Even with example 2, if you look at it closely, you will still realize the fact that it still, remove flexibility of being able to control how we want our function to respond and give us output as at when we want, the way we want it. So that is the reason why a callback is preferred in a situation like this in order to solve the problem of manual calling of function. Now, key takeaways. Number one, callback gives control and flexibility. And the key benefit of a callback actually is that it allows for deferred execution, meaning the callback function does not run immediately. Number two, functions can be passed as arguments. Because functions in JavaScript can be treated like any other variable or object, you can pass them as arguments to other functions.